Thank you very much to everyone for coming, especially to Whiteman and everyone at the center for the invitation, and for Dora for all the arrangements and putting up with my much dithering. In reflecting on the title of the day, and thinking about what I wanted to speak on today, I was particularly interested in the sort of Venn diagram of East Asian art and digital art history. More and more work in digital art history addresses East Asian topics, Chinese art and others, but I am not sure that we have necessarily been as conscious or explicit in thinking about the stakes of the digital in relationship to East Asian topics in a way that I think that we have also been working to try to think about whether art history addresses how art history as a discipline plays out in relationship to East Asian topics. And so I'm interested in this idea of not just a sort of digital art history, but of what a digital East Asian art history might be. And so I want to start with, in thinking about my presentation today, to ask about some sort of prompts or provocations. First, what does it mean to say that digital humanities is inherently Eurocentric or reflective of a global contemporary epistemology? How would we go about decentering digital humanities? What would the methodological, historiographic, and ethical dimensions of that decentering be? And what might an Asian-centered digital art history look like? Digital humanities has, over the years, been subjected to a variety of critiques as it's developed as a discipline, as a methodology, as a sort of series of tools or approaches to expanding or extending humanistic study. Critiques around gender, around labor and the nature of academic labor, and particularly of sort of broad neoliberal critiques around the sort of connections between academic labor and the industries that work in producing digital tools. There is a sort of larger problem in digital art history, it seems to me, of the projecting of the sort of naturalization of technological epistemologies through art. And what I mean by that, it might be best explained through a sort of broad analogy towards mapping. And maps, which is also the topic of another current piece of research of mine, in which the sort of modern Western and now global Western approach to cartography that emerged during the Enlightenment and then developed through the 19th and 20th centuries, and now the global digital view that is inside everyone's phone and on everyone's computer has not only become universal, but has been mistaken as universal. And that analogy, I think, can also be extended to the digital. And I think it's important that we take a step back to think about the ways in which sort of certain cultural assumptions and technological assumptions associated with the digital have been assumed or understood as universal. Like other critiques of the digital, this is intended to draw attention as much to the nature of the tool. This idea is intended to draw as much attention to the nature of the tool or the industry or sociality behind it, both of which are now ubiquitous, as to its application, which is it's still evolving. Which is to say that what we are doing here is in part trying to advance its application, to refine, to develop our understanding of how those are doing. And I'm hoping to ask some questions, many of which you've, I'm sure, already thought about, that might help continue to do that. And so in thinking about a decentered, in thinking about a decentered history of, or a decentered digital art history in China, I'm thinking about a number of criteria. I'm thinking about problems and methods that are rooted in place, that are rooted in the linguistic and spatial problems of China or East Asia. Thinking about how tools can be applied to art historical questions that are particular to Chinese or East Asian art history. I'm thinking very much about making as a form of practice and doing as a form of practice. This is not in any way particular to East Asian digital art history, but it has particular valences given that the objects that we are focusing on are made differently. And I want to think about the ways in which the making of my tools and my projects are related to the making of the things that I'm trying to understand. And I also want to think about the idea that that the format of our presentation, our format of our communication, and our arguments are interconnected. That we and that involves the opportunity to think outside of certain types of written text and scholarly modes of presentation that have become universal in modern academia and in modern museum studies, or perhaps less in museum context, which are thinking ahead in this way. But thinking carefully about how the products of our research, the outputs of our research, are connected to the process itself. So in my talk today, I'm going to briefly show two projects, one past and one current, and to sort of illustrate some of these ideas. And I want to just start by thanking many of the people on the screen who have been involved first in digital Longmei, which I'll talk about in a second, Sebastian Hahn, Daniel Hoffman, and Freeway White. And then the virtual mountain estate, particularly my co-PI, Hee-Jun Sum at National University of Singapore, but also Jinyao Yongfeng, who are both graduate students of mine, Vanessa Ong and Amber Chan, who have done a huge amount of modeling, are publishers in Sydney, Marnie Williams, Katrina Grant, and Bishu Janapalan, who's now a professor at DePaul, and who built the original models and was one of the original PIs on this project. I will say up front, there's no AI in this project. I'm happy to talk more about AI. It's something you can think about, but I tend to think about it in a sort of very specific tool way, and I am interested in where it goes, but it's not related to this project or what this talk is about today. So let's see if I can successfully do this. Oh, many of you are probably familiar with this animation, which is now rather old. It's a animation from the British Museum of a shanzhuang painting in their collection. And it gives a place to start thinking about my work and work in general on spatial problems and opportunities and reconstructing vision in Chinese art. This is obviously an animation of a painting. It's of interest to me because when I try to figure out the painting that I'm going to show in just a second, our Lungmei painting, the first solution that was offered to me was basically this, and it's really problematic in a whole variety of ways that I imagine are pretty obvious. But what it does is it takes a 2D composition on a vertical format and simulates a 3D space by basically slicing it into a series of layers and then sort of projecting it over 3D. It does, in some ways, do something that I think is really important for understanding Chinese painting. It gives a sense of how paintings are supposed to be imaginatively read, right? The idea that what we're supposed to do is project ourselves across the picture plane and sort of imaginatively roam inside the space of the landscape painting. It does give some sense of that. But it is, in other respects, entirely untrue to the original work. It doesn't tell us anything about the composition or space. It interpolates new elements like flying birds that don't exist in the original painting. It creates something that is really about a spectacle, which is fine insofar as it goes, but doesn't offer any real insight into the artist's conception or understanding of how Xiang made this work. And as such, I think is also a useful object lesson. I don't want to sort of beat a dead horse about what it is or isn't, but a useful object lesson in a project that isn't, in my view, super well rooted in the art that it's trying to come to terms with. And it is not an unusual approach. If you've been to the NPM, to the Gugong in Taipei in the last 5 years, they put a lot of energy into models like that, which are a little bit fictitious. Make you a little nauseous, actually. I don't mean that in a bad way. Like I get like car sick very easily, and the washi like it's a little like oh god. Anyway, and so I worked for a while on this painting that you see here, the Lungmei View of Rohe, which is a Qing painting, trying to think about how to reconstruct local situated vision in the case of this painting. It is a painting that is of this garden that you see on the right, Bishu shanzhuang, and it is in some respects looks quite like a perspectival painting. There is a sort of large, broadly perspectival avenue that heads up the center, but it also in many, many ways departs from perspectival painting. It was through, especially because there are sort of several different ways of composing a landscape that you see here, the perspectival element, but also something that looks more like a traditional construction of landscape around the edges. It was through some original sort of play and experimentation possible to reconstruct the prospect that Lung Mei, clearly either Lung Mei or someone, made close observation from a specific site south of the city of what is now Chengde, from which they would have at least designed, if not executed, this painting. And then through further testing, it was possible to determine that not only did they have a specific vantage point or two specific vantage points from which the painting was made, but that actually that the buildings around the lake, not in the hills, but around the lake, were the product of trigonometric surveying, which was current in the court at that time. And this sort of allows us to see, that Lung Mei, or at least for the lake area, was sort of doing a sort of Albertian style form of spatial projection onto a pictorial plane. But in some respects, the illustration, the sort of map that I was most interested in or most excited about and talked very little about in the project that published this work was this map here, which is a map that doesn't look so much at the floor of the valley where the lakes are, but rather at the mountains above, and sees in the ways in which what you could see from this vantage point in terms of the mountain ridges, sort of down the, can you see a mouse layer? Sort of these sort of ridges here, one, two, this guy here, which comes up like a dragon, and then here, and then also this section over here. These actually follow quite closely the various veins that are shown in the mountain, except that what Lung Mei has done in a sort of typical Chinese painting fashion is drag them up, is stretch them up to make them more dramatic, to emphasize the Longmai part of this composition. And so I say this because the sort of flaw to my project, not the flaw, the project works fine. And it's published and I have tenure and you can't take it away. What I need to say is that the flaw from the perspective of what I'm talking about today, which I want to highlight, is this works. This works because Lung Mei was using a form of projection, a form of mathematical projection that mirrors or echoes what happens with camera position in a gaming engine, right? If he hadn't been, all I would have gotten was a negative answer. I might have learned something from that negative answer, but this is a project that worked in terms of the sort of Eurocentrism of digital tools. The idea that cameras have to do with a certain type of optical projection that is a sort of essentially sort of Western idea of how perspective works, was okay here because that corresponded with what Lung Mei was doing. But if it hadn't, then I would have been stuck. And here, that's why I want to draw out this image, because this is the one that begins to depart, that begins to actually say, well, here's something where Lung Mei wasn't doing that. He was doing something else, and I still was able to gain insight through this tool that I was pushing a little bit. I'm already well behind schedule. It's fine. It'll be fine. So my early work, really sort of my first big project was thinking a lot about vision and sight. And that work has been extended or adapted to also through Bishu shanzhuang to be thinking about environmental problems, not ecological problems, but questions around space and the environment, our physical environment and our sort of experiential environment, and trying to reconstruct experience through of landscape. And here, I'm going to show a little bit about something called the virtual mountain estate, which is this project with Hidron Sum at NUS that comes from a larger initiative that we've called XSheds. And I'll explain what XSheds is in a second, but maybe I should explain here. The idea that we are, through deep modeling of historic experience, trying to figure out what the experience shed of a particular environment is. If you know what a view shed is, which is a sort of basic GIS tool, but also has an earlier sort of press, a view shed is what you can see from any given vantage point, right? If I'm standing here, what can I see? That's my view shed. And that's a sort of basic tool that we used in, or I used in Long May, was trying to understand what his view shed from a particular place was. So we've extended that to try to think about what the experience shed is. I have an experience shed in this room, an X shed in this room, but I have no experience of what's happening outside this room because it's beyond the boundaries of that experiential space. And and so what we're trying to think about is how deep modeling of historic experience can offer insight into the nature of landscape experience in early modern China. We are thinking through a number of sort of specific methods: source and model constraint, how to control what we're doing, interactivity and an immersion as the possibilities of sort of extending experience, and first person experience without being embodied in a particular character. And we're also trying to avoid a number of sort of big, I think, risks or perils in this type of project, including like the sort of obvious low-hanging fruit, gamification, and the sort of false promise of authenticity, which are both quite dangerous. And just as a sort of brief highlight, I want to mention a project that I imagine many of you are familiar with, which is a project that is both sort of thrilling in its scope and perhaps risky in the lines that it walks. Virtual Encore. Does everybody knows Virtual Encore? Virtual Encore is a absolutely massive model of Encore, not just of Angkor Wat, but the areas around Angkor, that has been compiled through like 20, 30 years of really extraordinary archaeological work. It is sort of very, very deeply sourced in the site. But it also is something that you watch from a disembodied position, and you watch a whole bunch of characters that are moving around and doing a variety of things, and it's actually a place where AI might become quite interesting. What can agent-based modeling, what can AI do in the context of agent-based modeling? I can't quite remember whether they use agent-based modeling here or if they actually just sort of program everything. I once knew the answer to that question. But in any case, it is a sort of a large project that's made a number of quite distinctive decisions from what we have done, that I think is very interesting. It's also highly cinematic in a way that ours is not, pretty intentional. I should say I love it, Virtual Encore, but it makes me vaguely ill every time. Not ill like parsec ill, but ill as in like, oh, I don't know if I should like this type of thing. I also really like the people who do it, who I think are very, very serious. So I need to move it along. So I will assume some of your knowledge on what I'm interested in. What we're working on right now is so the first thing I should say is that in deciding what we want, how we were going to reconstruct experience, we decided that we needed to come up with a unit of experience, if you will. And the unit of experience is the Qing, and which is appropriate because at Bishu shanzhuang, the Kangxi Emperor, as you know, produced, as so many garden owners did, produced a series of Qing that combined images and text into a sort of poetic, a word text dyad that describes the space, interacts with your experience and your memory of the real space, interacts with the sort of long history of people who have enjoyed that space and interacted that space. In that case, Shihu is a better example than Bishu shanzhuang, because Bishu shanzhuang was sort of created ex nihilo, and Shihu has this sort of millennium of interest. It was almost certainly inspired in part by Shihu, which was a place that Kangxi really loved, et cetera, et cetera. We also sort of took advantage of a pun to sort of underline the idea that that a neck shed is not only a jing, it's also a jing, right? It's bounded. It's got this sort of like, you imagine a sort of play or bubble around you that is the extent of that neck shed. It's a bounded thing, and there are things that occur beyond your realm. What this does is it allows us to think very carefully about not modeling everything, not attempting to model everything, keeping what we're trying to do, what we're trying to think through within a sort of some serious constraints. And I think that that's a very important, just like the sort of, just like the problems of LLMs, like what you put in is what you'll get out. And we want to be very careful about what we put in so that we are producing something that we think adheres very closely to the sources that we're working with. And I've already said this, we want to sort of think about the sort of connection between real space, like the site itself, its remediation and the materiality of that remediation in the book, and also the sort of cultural mediation that occurs through Qing and the memory of Qing. Our sort of core source for the experience itself. So when you go into a space, I'm going to show you this in a second, just so you know, I'm just trying to build up the tension and excitement for you. Or the possibility of disappointment. One way or the other. The sort of key source is of course the poems and the images, particularly the poems of the Kangxi Emperor, the prefaces and poems. And you see highlighted in yellow the poems and text, the prose and poetic text, and also the sort of significant difference between this and other work that I've done and others have done is it really dives deeply into the commentary that is addressed. And so we think not only about what the types of clouds are, but what poetic references it's referring to. And so one of the things that's important to stress is that while what we're trying to do is recreate the experience of an 18th century reader or visitor or viewer, right? Which means that even for most of us who have broad knowledge of Chinese, who most of us are native speakers of Chinese, not me obviously, but certainly for a museum going viewer, this textual tradition is actually not something that we have at our fingertips the way an 18th century viewer would have. Right? And so we need to figure out how to not only bring in the environmental and the sensory, but also the sort of knowledge that is required to understand this experience as it was intended. And so we draw on these texts, we highlight key types of sensory and spatial cues, and this leads to the creation of an ontological framework that is particular to Chinese experience, to Chinese understandings of experience and Chinese understandings of space, and the sensory and emotional and cognitive encounters with space that form the experience of a jing. And then, as a result, to an extension of the CDOC conceptual reference model that focuses specifically on experience in pre-modern or early modern China, specifically on experience within the context of this project. And that's an area, CDOC is a good example of a place in which a lot of the work that has been done has sort of unintentionally become Eurocentric, right? CDOC is describing a series of things that are basically rooted in European or Western understandings or global contemporary understandings of human experience, which is not what we're trying to talk about here. So in and of itself, it is inadequate to our work. I want to move quickly through what I'm going to show now. I want to show you a little bit about how we've also reconstructed the space, because we have to recreate a physical environment. And so we've reconstructed the space through a variety of sources as well as the site. This really builds on my earlier work on reconstructing the landscape. One particular example is the interiors. The interiors, we have to be very careful. We have no sources that attest precisely to the decoration of Kangxi interiors. the Qianzhedang does not, for Kangxi doesn't exist. And so what we do is we rely on Qianlong and later Qianzhedang, or furnishing archives, for those who don't know what the Qianzhedang is, to reconstruct. And the other thing is, when you have an exterior of a building, right, you have no idea how the interior of that building is distributed. So a student of mine developed a method for basically reconstructing the interior arrangement of space through the Qianzhedang, through a series of drawings, and then sourcing representative works from extant collections that correspond to the types of things that are listed in Qianzhedang, but are not the object specific, because we don't know. The Qianzhedang says a jade duck. It doesn't say the jade duck that's ended up in the Gulong today. So we don't know what it is. So what we do is we sort of create what we call plausible fiction about the interior that is intended to sustain the primary research question, which is this experience that we've reconstructed. Okay. So I want to show you this really quickly. I hope it's not really loud. I'm going to turn it down. So it's now being turned into a VR and also into online publications, which I'll tell you about in a second. This video is about 3 minutes long, so it's going to take most of the remaining time I have. But this is you operating through the VR to select the sites. The 3 sites we've chosen.
西岭晨霞，雨歇更阑斗柄东。晨霞聚散四方风，时光岂在凌云聚。寡过清谈以手中。
So we start with the emperor's voice, so-called, because with the there's a really nice Taiwanese actor, and the print, and then sort of take you through highlighting different sections of the preface, because we want to highlight both the sort of relationship to the source, but the idea that this is a remediation of a remediation, right? The prints are remediation of experience. This is another version of the same. And so we are linking ourselves back through a chain of making to Kangxi, is this idea. And we take you inside, we enter the pavilion, you see now the interior, which has changed some. This video is now about a year old. It turns out you don't know where you are yet. One of the key features of this poem is the surprise to discover that this is a 2-story building. So we have to have you look in the wrong direction before, oh look, there's the staircase. But how you do surprise as a clear part of the experience that you're supposed to have is actually not so obvious in our experience, without something jumping out at you. You then go downstairs, where you, again, sorry, look around. I complained that the first version of this video was too long, too short, too fast, and now I feel like it's too long. I want to get going. And then you go out onto the boat landing, where you enjoy the auspicious mist, which is this sort of rainbow wutai mist. And the idea is, and then you'll be able to open, you'll be able to open and discover more tab, where you'll be able to read more information that essentially is derived from the commentary, the interlinear commentary of the poetry. It tells you about the poetic references, tells you what it's supposed to associate, which is, of course, to liken Bishu shanzhuang to a sort of immortal's mountain, which is marked by this auspicious cloud formation. And then you eventually come back out and you go. And there are 2 other scenes, and all 3 scenes are for architecture that's no longer extant. So there is a sort of also recovery aspect to it. I have very little time, so I will move quickly through to say that, let me just sort of think about what I'm going to use my last minute for. The idea here, or 2 minutes, the idea is to think, in this case, about presentation that is responsive to the original media. And here I sort of want to highlight an early example that is quite different, but I think has really been inspirational for me. I wrote a review of the Chinese painting calligraphy, the Seattle Art Museum Chinese painting calligraphy, OSCE, early on in my career, and I found it really, really inspirational. This is, if you haven't used it, it's sort of a remarkable tool, but it's designed, as opposed to every other OSCE, which is an online systematic catalog, which project that the Getty funded. which basically just mimicked the format of a book and like had a painting, and then you could blow it up and it was great, but then it just had a text. The Sayamowski was built around the sort of way in which you interact with a Chinese painting. And it drew out seals, and it drew out inscriptions, and it allowed you to scroll through. And it was really something that completely rethought the format of the publication to be responsive to the thing that it was trying to describe. And I thought that was extraordinary. And that's really what we are trying to do here. I think we have an opportunity in the digital to think through how we present and to move past the codex, to move past the linear text, to thinking about forms of articulation and expression that are related to what we're doing. And so here I would sort of offer the idea that if what we want to do is think about and interrogate, really not just think about, but interrogate the idea of experience, then presenting a model that is flawed, that is limited, that is at best a sort of approximation. It is a model. It is not the thing itself. But presenting a model of experience is perhaps a way worth exploring to do that. And so, in conclusion, I'm going to skip ahead through all of that. There was stuff about how we're disseminating this that we can talk about later. I want to say, in his essay on visualizing data drawn from the accounts of Holocaust survivors, digital humanist Todd President describes what he terms an ethics of the algorithm. He defines that ethics as one in which the database is conceived through the same ethical optic with which we approach our other sources. This ethical position is a function both of our own practice as researchers, the ethics of how we approach and engage with our sources, and with the nature of the knowledge embedded within them. Just as in other modes of historical research in which we seek to identify methods and interpretive lenses that are centered in the historical and cultural context in which we work, our digital practices must also be founded in, rather than imposed upon, the sources, materials, and histories of Asia as best we understand them. As with modern academic research more broadly, this process is complicated by the fundamental Eurocentric bias of the digital. From the cultural assumptions upon which our tools are built to the majority of exemplars through which the field has been to date developed. In recentering our approach to digital methods, we create the opportunity to explore new questions and offer new interpretations of familiar works, just as we find the tools to expand our view and subvert the hierarchies of received canons and historiographies. The challenge before us is to continue to push the boundaries of our work, methodologically and in terms of the larger stakes we seek to claim, thereby simultaneously realizing and redefining the possibilities offered through the digital. Thank you.